What was the rough timeline for how MRI scanning and other neuroimaging techniques became more common? You said they were just coming into practice like around the
Yeah.
early 2000s.
Well, it's like the timeline is that MRI was invented like in the 70s, basically, and in the 80s and 90s, it started to become more available for clinical uses in hospitals. But that's really structural MRI. You're just looking at the structures of the brain, just like you would get an X-ray of your leg or something. You just want to see what the parts are on the inside, and that's really useful for a lot of clinical purposes. You want to know there's a tumor in there, for example. So in the 1980s, all the functional brain imaging was really done with PET, positron emission tomography. And the deal with PET is that you ingest a radioactive tracer, and then you watch which regions of the brain take up that tracer. And you could do things like, labeling glucose, for example, so you can see where glucose metabolism is. When neurons are doing a lot of stuff, they will then show up brighter on the PET scan. There's a lot of downsides to PET scan. One is that, like, sticking radioactivity in people is generally frowned upon. Not great if you can avoid it. Also, it doesn't give you great temporal resolution because of the decay time, and you're sort of aggregating across large periods of time, so you can't really see things that are changing quickly. So in the early 90s is when people first realized that you could use MRI to try to see brain function, and it relied on this discovery that the deoxygenated form of hemoglobin, the molecule in the blood that carries oxygen, when it has the oxygen molecule compared when it doesn't have the oxygen molecule, it shows up differently on MRI scan. Certain MRI scans that are tuned in a particular way. It's a very subtle effect. And then over the course of the next decade, people worked out the technology to be able to exploit that factor, what we call blood oxygen level dependent signal, BOLD signal, to be able to measure brain activity. And so that was happening throughout the 90s, and cognitive neuroscientists were following that and were certainly interested in it. Some of the first fMRI studies were in the mid 90s. But the technology was not user friendly at the time. When I did my first MRI scans in the late 90s, and the equipment was so different. Nowadays, it's like an iPhone. You just push a button and it does what it needs to do. Back then, you had to have like a separate computer to do your shimming and read off the numbers and then type in the numbers from this machine into that machine. It's much more like mechanical.
So they've become smaller and cheaper, I guess. I've heard with physicists where, especially when they have like these big fancy space telescopes, they have to fight over the hours of, when you get to use it. Is it the same way with MRI machines, or is it pretty like every lab can have their own now?
Well, they're very expensive. I mean, it was for a while like that because the only places that had them were hospitals, and scientists wanting to use them had to compete with all the clinical uses. And of course, if someone needs it for clinical use, that takes precedence over us doing our tinkering around and
Mm-hmm.
trying to find out what's happening in the brain for science. So, but nowadays there are a lot more research dedicated MRI scanners, like the one that we have. I'm the co-director of the Dornsife Neuroimaging Center, and so I help to run the center at USC, where we have our own research dedicated scanner, and that's more common now at major universities. But you're talking about an investment of several $1 million to get that set up. So it's not like every lab has one. They're generally shared lab spaces. So the one we have is shared by basically anyone on the USC main campus who wants to do this kind of research.
Mm-hmm. And do you think it's comparable to computers in let's say the 60s maybe, where they're big and expensive, but in 50 years from now, you think they'll be much cheaper and maybe portable?
I don't think so. I mean, there are some physical constraints there that don't come into play with computers. You have the physics of the magnetic fields. In order to make this work, you need an incredibly strong magnetic field. The magnetic field we have in our magnet is 3 Tesla. It's the kind of thing you could pull a car across the room. And so it's this big coil of wires, and that coil is cooled to basically absolute zero, so that there's no friction in the wires, and the current can run fast enough to produce that strength of magnetic field. So that's big, and there are other clunky parts to it that sort of have to be the size they are. Also, you want at least the head to fit into it, if not the body. So I don't know. I mean, there are some experiments with low field fMRI that you can actually squeeze more juice out of that with new technologies, but I don't think it's going to be the kind of thing that we all have on our desktop.